Hello, dear listeners. Before we dive into this new journey of secrets and passions, I want to know, what was the craziest thing you've ever done for someone, or that someone has done for you? Leave it in the comments. I love reading your stories, they make our community more alive. Now, prepare your hearts, because today's story begins with a storm and a knock on the door that would change everything. The rain lashed against the window of Elena Rossi's small studio as if begging to enter. It was almost 11 at night, and the only light in the room came from a yellowish lamp over her drafting table, where sketches of gardens and landscapes were scattered. Elena loved that silence. It was the only moment when the world stopped. But the silence was broken by a knock on the door. It wasn't a timid knock, but 3 sharp, authoritative raps that made Elena jump from her chair. She hesitated. Her building, in the city's artsy district, didn't usually get visitors at that hour. With a racing heart, she peeked through the peephole and recoiled, incredulous. Outside, soaked by the rain and looking like he had run a marathon, was Julian Blackwood. Julian was a name that needed no introduction. He was the country's most renowned architect, owner of Blackwood Designs, and, technically, Elena's boss. She was just a junior landscape architect at his firm, accustomed to seeing him at the top of his glass tower, impeccable, cold, and distant as a marble statue. But the man at her door was the opposite of a statue. His designer shirt was plastered to his chest by the water, his dark hair fell chaotically over his forehead, and his gray eyes, usually so controlled, radiated a contained panic. Elena opened the door, still holding her pencil as if it were a weapon. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice came out as a thread. "Has something happened with the park project?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He entered without waiting for an invitation, bringing with him the smell of cold rain and an expensive woody perfume that invaded Elena's small sanctuary. He looked around, seeming out of place among the second-hand furniture and the plants that filled the apartment. "Forget the park, Elena," he said, his voice hoarse, running a hand through his wet hair. "I'm about to lose the Villa d'Este." Elena's eyes went wide. The Villa d'Este was a historic property in Tuscany that the firm had been trying to restore for years. It was Julian's dream project, his obsession. But Countess Bianchi was going to sign the contract tomorrow, Elena stammered. "The Countess," Julian let out a dry, humorless laugh, "is a woman of the old world. She called my partner an hour ago. She said she reevaluated my moral suitability. She thinks a single man, focused only on profits and concrete, doesn't have the soul necessary to care for her family's legacy. She said she would only sell to someone who understood the value of family, of love, of roots." He stopped pacing and turned to Elena. The intensity in his gaze sucked the air from her lungs. "She said she heard rumors that I'm a heartless playboy. And if I don't prove otherwise at the gala dinner tomorrow night, when she arrives in town, the deal is off. She'll sell to a generic hotel chain that will demolish the gardens." Elena felt a tightness in her chest. She knew the gardens of that villa. She herself had spent sleepless nights studying the local botany, dreaming of restoring them, even knowing that, as a junior, she would never lay hands on them. "That's terrible, Mr. Blackwood. But why are you here? You have a huge contact list. Models, actresses, surely one of them can accompany you." "No," Julian cut in, taking a step toward her. The vulnerability in his face was something Elena had never seen. Models and actresses can't tell the difference between a camellia and a gardenia. They don't know the history of the villa. If I take a stranger, the Countess will sniff out the lie in 5 minutes. She'll ask questions about the soil, about the vision, things only you know. The silence fell heavy between them. Elena began to understand, and panic rose in her throat. "Mr. Blackwood, no. You wrote the preliminary report on the gardens, Elena. I read it. It was the most passionate and detailed thing I've ever seen come out of that office. You know the soul of that place better than I do. He took a deep breath, looking like a man about to jump off a cliff. I need you to go with me to the dinner tomorrow. As your consultant? She asked, with a thread of hope. Julian stared at her, his gray eyes fixed on her brown ones. No. As my fiancée. Elena dropped the pencil. It hit the floor with a snap that echoed through the room. That's madness, she whispered. I am your employee. I live in a studio, I take the subway, and my clothes are from thrift stores. You are, you. No one will believe that Julian Blackwood fell in love with the plant girl. They will believe it, he insisted, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. Because you are the only person in the company who doesn't tremble when I enter the room. You are the only one who has ever corrected me in a meeting. The Countess wants to see passion? You have passion to spare. He took another step, invading her personal space. I know about your parents' flower shop, Elena, he said. Elena froze. What? I know the bank is threatening to seize the property next week. I know that's why you work overtime and take freelance jobs. He didn't say it with cruelty, but with the urgency of someone playing their last card. If you do this for me, just for one night, to convince the Countess, I will pay off your parents' debt. The flower shop will be theirs, free and clear, forever. He held her gaze, the rain beating against the glass like a frenetic drum. Please, Elena, he whispered, and for the first time, the great architect seemed just a desperate man asking for help to save his dream. Be my fiancé. Just tomorrow. Elena looked at the man in front of her, then at the sketches on her desk, and thought of her parents. The logical world screamed no. But her heart, traitorous and curious, already knew the answer. The next morning, the air in the glass and steel office of Blackwood Design seemed thinner than usual. The constant hum of computers and the murmur of stressed architects created a symphony of tension, but for Elena, the noise seemed distant. She was sitting at her small desk in the corner of the landscaping department, trying to focus on an irrigation plan, but her hands were trembling slightly. The image of Julian at her door the night before, soaked and desperate, seemed like a fever dream. At 9:15 sharp, the internal messenger appeared at her desk. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you. Now. Elena swallowed hard, smoothed the skirt of her simple dress, and walked toward the private elevator that led to the penthouse. As she ascended, she felt the weight of every floor. She wasn't going to see the vulnerable man from last night, she was going to see the boss. Julian's office door was open. The space was vast, minimalist, and intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city like a chessboard below. Julian was standing before a complex model, impeccable in a tailored navy blue suit. Not a hair was out of place. The architect god was back in his armor. Close the door, please, Elena, he said, without turning around. His voice was calm, controlled, professional. Elena obeyed. The click of the lock sounded like a sentence. Julian turned and walked to his glass desk, where a tablet was on. I've prepared the foundation, he said, gesturing for her to approach. If we are going to convince Countess Bianchi, our story needs to be structurally sound. No flaws. He tapped the screen, displaying a meticulously drawn timeline. We met 18 months ago at the Design Expo in Milan. You were admiring the structure of the Japanese pavilion. I was impressed by your analysis of the integration of nature with concrete. He looked at her, his face impassive. We have been engaged for 3 months. The ring is being arranged. We kept it discreet because I value my privacy and didn't want the media turning this into a circus. He continued to recite fabricated details, their favorite restaurant, a French place Elena could never afford, the type of movies they watched, architectural documentaries, and how they spent Sundays, visiting art galleries. It was cold. It was clinical. It was an architectural blueprint of a relationship, where every beam and column was in the right place, but no one lived inside. Elena listened in silence, feeling a chill grow in her stomach. When he finished, he waited for her to take the tablet and start studying. Instead, Elena took a step back. "This will collapse at the first gust of wind," she said, her voice low but firm. Julian frowned, the mask of perfection cracking slightly. "Excuse me?" "The timeline is perfect. The facts are unassailable." "Julian, Countess Bianchi isn't a building inspector," Elena retorted, surprising herself with her own courage. She took a step toward his desk. "She is a woman who has lived in a 500-year-old villa, surrounded by history and passion. She isn't going to interrogate us about dates or French restaurants." She looked directly into his gray eyes. "She will look at us and search for the silence. That comfortable silence of two people who know each other. She will observe if you know how I take my coffee. She will look for the way I look at you when you are talking about a project you love." Elena shook her head. "If we look like two strangers reciting an instruction manual, she will sell the villa to the hotel chain before dessert. No one will believe we are engaged if there is no truth in the touch." Julian stood motionless. He was used to building skyscrapers that defied gravity, but the emotional logic Elena presented was engineering he did not master. He looked at the timeline on the tablet, then at Elena. He realized, with growing discomfort, that she was right. His perfect plan had no soul. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked, arrogance giving way to genuine curiosity. "Improvisation?" "No," said Elena, straightening her posture. A new confidence took over her. She knew little about his world, but she knew everything about cultivating living things. And a relationship, even a fake one, needed roots. "We need memories. We need common ground, something that isn't in a PDF file." Julian crossed his arms, waiting. "We're running out of time. The dinner is tonight." "Then let's start now," challenged Elena. A slight, bold smile touched her lips. "Take me to lunch. But not to Le Jardin or wherever you take your investors to impress them with silver cutlery." She held his gaze, the command implicit in her soft voice. "Take me to the place you go when you want to escape being the great Julian Blackwood. The place where you eat when no one is looking. Take me to lunch not as my boss, but as my fiancé." Julian Blackwood, the man who redesigned the city's skyline, was speechless. He looked at his landscape assistant, with her simple dress and defiant brown eyes, and realized that, for the first time in years, someone had taken control out of his hands. He turned off the tablet. The glow of the black screen reflected his surprised face. "All right," he said, grabbing his car keys, a dangerous and intrigued glint appearing in his eyes. "But I warn you, you might not like what you find outside this glass tower." Elena didn't back down. "I'm counting on it." Julian's car, a black sports sedan that looked like a spaceship, glided through the busy streets of the financial district. Elena expected him to stop at some hidden bistro in the upscale streets, but Julian kept driving, crossing the invisible border that separated the wealthy city from the old, worn industrial zone. He stopped in front of an establishment with a neon sign blinking erratically, "Joe's Market." It was a place with exposed brick walls and the smell of frying food and strong coffee. "Here?" Elena asked, arching an eyebrow. "They make the best pastrami sandwich in the city," said Julian, turning off the car. "And Joe doesn't know who I am. To him, I'm just the suit guy who eats too fast." Inside, the noise of clattering plates and loud conversations was the opposite of the office's sterile quiet. They sat in a torn red vinyl booth. Julian took off his jacket and, in a gesture that seemed strangely intimate, loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar. For a moment, the untouchable architect disappeared, and only a tired and hungry man emerged. The sandwiches arrived, mountains of meat and cheese. Julian picked his up with his hands, unceremoniously. "Right," he said, wiping the corner of his mouth with a cheap paper napkin. "The Countess will ask about the future. We have to align our vision on where we will live. I have 3 properties that..." Elena reached across the table and lightly touched his forearm. His muscle tensed under her touch, but he didn't pull away. "Julian," she said softly. "Stop. I am not your employee right now. And you are not my boss. We are having lunch." She withdrew her hand, but his skin tingled where she had touched. "Tell me something real," she asked. "Something that isn't in your Forbes biography or on the company website." Julian hesitated. He looked at the sandwich, then at the dusty window. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was expectant. "Before architecture," he began, his voice low, almost embarrassed, "I wanted to be a watchmaker." Elena smiled, surprised. "A watchmaker?" "I was fascinated by gears. Small, intricate, invisible to the world, but they made time move." He looked at his own hands, hands that now drew gigantic skyscrapers. "My father said it was a waste. Blackwoods build legacies that touch the sky, not toys that fit in a pocket," he said. "So, I went into architecture." He sighed, a heavy sound. "Sometimes, I look at those glass buildings I design and feel like they are just pretty cages. I miss working with something I can hold in my hands, something that has a mechanical heartbeat." The confession hung between them. Julian Blackwood, the man who shaped the city's skyline, dreamed of small, hidden things. The revelation made Elena's chest tighten. "And you, Elena?" he asked, turning the tables. "What is your dream? Besides saving the flower shop?" Elena blushed, playing with the straw of her soda. "It's silly." "Tell me," he insisted, his gray eyes now focused on her with genuine intensity. "I want to create a seed sanctuary," she said, her eyes shining. "An urban garden, but focused only on plants that are endangered or forgotten. Flowers that no one cultivates anymore because they aren't commercial or pretty enough. I want a place where rejected things can bloom." Julian watched her. He saw the passion in her face, the way she spoke about protecting the forgotten. He realized, with a jolt, that she wasn't just the quiet landscape girl. She was a guardian. The drive back to the office was different. The silence in the car wasn't tense anymore, it was charged with a new curiosity. Julian stopped the car at the building's service entrance so they wouldn't be seen arriving together. Before Elena got out, he looked at the dashboard and then at her. "Elena." She turned, her hand on the handle. Julian leaned in. The movement was slow, hesitant, giving her all the time in the world to get out of the car. She didn't leave. He reached out and, instead of touching her face, he picked something that was caught in her hair, a small dried leaf brought by the wind at the restaurant exit. He twirled the leaf between his fingers. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "For not letting me have lunch at Le Jardin." Then, on an impulse he couldn't control, he leaned in a little closer and pressed his lips to her cheek. It was a brief, chaste brush, near the corner of her mouth. His stubble lightly scratched her soft skin. "See you at 7, he whispered. Elena got out of the car on shaky legs. She touched her cheek as the black car drove away. His touch still burned there. It was supposed to be just a business deal to save the flower shop. But that kiss, that simple kiss on the cheek in a service alley, felt like the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. On Saturday morning, hours before the dreaded gala dinner, Julian's car looked like an alien spaceship parked in front of Flora Rossi. The place was an explosion of colors and organized chaos. Vines climbed peeling walls, bags of fertilizer were piled at the entrance, and the smell of wet earth and basil was intense. Julian stepped out of the car, looking at his Italian leather shoes with apprehension. "Are you sure we need to go in?" he asked, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "The Countess won't be here." "No," said Elena, opening the iron gate that creaked loudly. "But if you're going to pretend to love the woman who grew up here, you need to know the difference between a begonia and a petunia. And you need to know the reason I am fighting." Before Julian could protest, a robust man with an apron soiled with dirt appeared at the door, wiping his hands on a cloth. It was Marco, Elena's father. Beside him, a small woman with a radiant smile, Sophia. "So this is the famous architect," Marco boomed, ignoring Julian's outstretched hand and pulling him into a bear hug that almost crumpled his designer suit. "Elena said you're a genius, but she didn't say you were so skinny. You need to eat, boy." Julian stiffened for a second, the shock of physical contact disarming him, but soon the couple's genuine hospitality made him relax. Sophia held Julian's face with both hands. "Thank you for coming. Elena speaks little of you, says you are very busy. But I see you have kind eyes. Eyes of someone who builds things to last." Guilt hit Julian like a punch. He was there to save a business, not to be adopted. But he didn't have time to process. "Since you're here, son-in-law," said Marco, winking, "can you lend a hand? The irrigation system in Greenhouse 3 broke and I don't understand anything about these modern pipes." "Elena said you like, what is it? Gears?" Half an hour later, the unthinkable happened. Julian Blackwood, the man who designed museums and opera houses, was without his jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a wrench in his hand, kneeling in the greenhouse mud. He wasn't just pretending. There was a complex pressure problem in the valves, a mechanical puzzle that fascinated him. As he worked, sweating and stained with grease, he felt a satisfaction that no digital blueprint had ever given him. When the water flowed through the pipes again, watering the thirsty orchids, Marco slapped him on the back hard. "Good job, boy. You have a knack for it. Maybe there's a gardener hiding under that expensive suit." Later, sitting on wooden crates in the back of the shop, they ate homemade focaccia that Sophia had brought. Julian listened to stories about Elena, the girl who cried when they cut down the street trees, the teenager who spent summers cataloging seeds. He looked at Elena, who was laughing with her parents, her hair tied up haphazardly and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked luminous. As the sun began to dip, painting the greenhouse gold, Sophia called Julian to see a rare rosebush. Away from Elena and Marco's ears, the mother's expression became serious. "You know, Julian," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We almost lost everything. The bank was merciless. But Elena, she never gave up on us. She carries the world on her back, if necessary, to protect those she loves." Sophia touched his arm, her eyes watery. "Take good care of my daughter's heart. She is like these orchids, she seems strong because she survives in the wild, but she needs delicate care to truly bloom. Don't let her wither in that glass tower." The words, spoken with such pure and innocent trust, made Julian's stomach turn. The weight of the lie was now unbearable. He was using their daughter's devotion as a bargaining chip. The drive back to Elena's apartment to prepare for the dinner was silent. But unlike the morning, the air was charged with a heavy intimacy. When he stopped the car, Julian didn't unlock the doors immediately. He looked at the steering wheel, his hands still bearing traces of grease he hadn't managed to clean off completely. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse, without looking at her. "Your parents. The greenhouse. They are intense, I know." She tried to laugh, but stopped upon seeing his expression. Julian turned to her. The CEO mask had completely disappeared. I don't remember the last time someone hugged me like your father did. Or that someone offered me food without expecting me to sign a check in return. The confession hung in the small space of the car. I spent 3 hours covered in mud fixing an old pipe, he continued, looking into her eyes with devastating sincerity. And I felt more at peace in your greenhouse, with your family, than at any awards gala I've been to in the last 10 years. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Julian. Let's go inside, he cut in, his voice hardening again, as if afraid of what he had just admitted. We have a show to stage. And after today, I promise I will never involve your family in my lies again. They deserve better. He got out of the car quickly, leaving Elena alone in the passenger seat, her heart beating wildly and a dangerous certainty growing in her chest. For her, this was no longer just an act. We're missing a detail. Julian broke the tense silence of the car as they entered the upscale part of the city. Night had already fallen, and the skyscraper lights were beginning to compete with the stars. The dress was already delivered to your apartment, makeup is scheduled. What's missing? Asked Elena, still stunned by the visit to her parents' house. A ring, said Julian, with the practical tone of someone discussing the support beam of a bridge. Countess Bianchi is observant. If we've been engaged for 3 months, your finger can't be bare. He stopped the car in front of a discreet shop with dark windows and only a heavy oak door. There was no sign, just a golden number, 1920. Inside, the air smelled of old wood wax and polished metal. It wasn't a modern, shiny jewelry store, it looked like a collector's vault. A gentleman with thick glasses, who was fixing the mechanism of an antique pocket watch, looked up. Mr. Blackwood. Came to pick up that Swiss chronograph? Not today, Arthur. I need something different. Julian placed his hand on the small of Elena's back, guiding her forward. The touch was light, but it burned through the thin fabric of her blouse. I need an engagement ring. Vintage. With history. None of that mass-produced modern stuff. The jeweler smiled, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Ah, I understand. For the young lady who finally made the clock stop? Elena blushed. Julian didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw was visible. Arthur brought a navy blue velvet tray. There were diamonds, rubies, sapphires. But Julian swept his eyes over all of them with indifference, until stopping at a ring in the corner. It wasn't an ostentatious diamond. It was an emerald cut in a square shape, surrounded by small gold details resembling intertwined ivy leaves. It was architecture and nature fused into a single piece. This one, said Julian, without hesitation. May I? He turned to Elena and took her left hand. His hand was warm, firm, a builder's hand. Her hand, calloused from working with soil and plants, seemed small in his. The contrast was stark, but somehow right. He slid the ring onto her ring finger. It passed over the knuckles and settled at the base of the finger as if it had been forged for her. Julian didn't let go of her hand. He stood looking at the ring, his thumb distractedly caressing the soft skin of Elena's palm. The world outside, the countess, the contract, the lie, seemed to disappear. There was only that velvety silence and their breathing in unison. It's beautiful, whispered Elena, afraid to break the spell. We'll take it, said Julian, his voice hoarse. He looked at the jeweler. Arthur, can you make an engraving on the inside? Now? Julian, you don't need to. Elena began, her heart racing. It's just for one night. No one will see the inside. Julian ignored her, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. I will know it's there. And if we are going to sell a story of eternal love to a woman who lives on legacies, every detail matters. He took a pen and wrote a single word on a piece of paper, handing it to the jeweler. Arthur read it, raised his eyebrows with approval, and nodded. 5 minutes. While they waited, Julian didn't move away. He remained close enough for Elena to feel the heat of his body. When Arthur returned and handed the ring to Julian, the architect held it against the light for a moment before taking Elena's hand again. Before putting it back on her finger, he tilted the ring so she could read the inscription freshly engraved on the inner gold. The word wasn't a date. It wasn't his name. It was a single word, engraved in elegant cursive. Foundation. Elena looked at him, stunned. Foundation? Julian held her gaze, serious and solemn. In architecture, the foundation is the most important part. It's what stays hidden, what no one sees, but it's what prevents everything from crumbling. Without it, beauty cannot sustain itself. He slid the ring back onto her finger. You are the foundation of this project, Elena. Without you, everything I've built collapses. The jeweler, observing the scene while polishing his glasses, smiled to himself. A perfect structural fit, he murmured softly. The technical phrase, spoken in that intimate setting, sounded like a prophecy. A perfect fit. Elena felt the weight of the emerald ring on her finger. It was supposed to be a theater prop, but with the word foundation hidden against her skin, it felt like the heaviest and most real promise she had ever carried. They left the shop in silence, but the space between them and the car seat had changed again. It was no longer the silence of boss and employee. It was the silence of two people who had just laid the cornerstone of something neither of them knew how to finish. Countess Bianchi loves Puccini and Viennese waltzes. There will be an orchestra. We need to be synchronized. It was almost 10 at night. The Blackwood Design's office was deserted, except for the vast central atrium, an imposing space of glass and steel where Julian had decided they would do the final rehearsal. The city lights filtered through the glass ceiling, casting long shadows on the polished marble floor. Julian placed his phone on a concrete bench and the notes of a classical waltz echoed, sounding lonely in that cavernous space. I know how to dance, Julian, said Elena, feeling small amidst that architectural grandeur. Knowing how to dance is one thing. Dancing with the precision necessary not to look clumsy in front of the European elite is another. He extended his hand, his expression serious as if he were about to review a structural calculation. Let's go. The first few minutes were an exercise in frustration. Julian led like he designed, with straight lines, precise angles, and absolute control. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. He counted aloud, close to her ear. Keep your spine straight, Elena. Your arm is sagging. The step was too short. He moved her across the hall as if she were a chess piece or a beam that needed to be fitted into the right place. Elena, tense from the proximity and constant criticism, began to stumble. The third time her sneaker scuffed his leather shoe, Julian stopped inside, running a hand through his hair. This isn't going to work. You're too tense. We look like two malfunctioning robots. Elena looked at him, at his rigid posture, his locked jaw. The irritation, fueled by fatigue and the pressure of the day, finally overflowed. The problem isn't me, Julian, she said, her voice echoing in the atrium. It's you. He looked at her, incredulous. Excuse me? I was a ballroom dancing champion in university. My technique is flawless. Exactly. It's just technique. She took a step toward him, invading his personal space. You are dancing as if you were building a building. Everything is rigid, controlled, calculated. But a waltz isn't reinforced concrete, Julian. It's wind. It's water. Before he could retort, Elena took his hand. Not with the hesitant delicacy of before, but with the firmness of someone who handles garden tools. She placed his hand on her waist and pulled him closer, breaking the professional distance he tried to maintain. "Stop counting," she ordered softly. "Forget the structure. In nature, nothing grows in perfectly straight lines. Trees sway so they don't break in the storm. You need to yield to lead." Julian looked down at her brown eyes shining with defiance. Her scent, something floral and earthy, so different from the sterile smell of the office, invaded his senses. For a moment, the great architect was disarmed. He was used to controlling gravity, not flowing with it. "Close your eyes," whispered Elena. "Elena, I can't lead with my eyes. Trust me." The word, the same one he had used when asking her to be his fiancée, now came back to him with a new weight. Julian hesitated, but closed his eyes. He felt her hand grip his shoulder. She began to move, not to the exact rhythm of the 1-2-3 count, but to the rhythm of the melody, the waves of the music. And, surprisingly, he followed. Without sight to calculate angles, Julian was forced to feel. To feel her body moving against his, to feel her breath, to feel the slight shift of weight. His body, trained for rigidity, began to relax. His shoulders dropped. The grip on her waist became less of a claw and more of an embrace. They glided across the marble. They were no longer boss and employee. They were the wind and the tree, moving in unison. The world of deadlines, contracts, and countesses disappeared. There was only the music and her warmth. He spun her, and the movement was fluid, organic. When he brought her back, their bodies collided gently, fitting perfectly, like the final piece of a puzzle. The music from the phone stopped abruptly, cut off by a message notification, but they didn't separate. They stood frozen in the center of the silent atrium, locked in the final pose of the dance. Julian's hand was splayed on her back, feeling Elena's accelerated breathing. Her face was tilted up to his, inches away. Julian opened his eyes. The gray of his eyes was dark, dilated. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes, and saw the same terrified desire reflected in them. The space between them vibrated. It would be the easiest thing in the world to tilt his head. It would be the most logical thing to do, the only possible conclusion to that surreal day. The project was becoming dangerously real. "Julian," Elena whispered, his name sounding like a plea or a warning. The sound of her voice seemed to wake him from a trance. He blinked and reality fell upon him like a bucket of cold water. He was the boss. She was the employee. This was a contractual lie to save a legacy, not an office romance. He released her waist abruptly and took a step back, adjusting his jacket with trembling hands. The cold air of the atrium invaded the space where her body had been, leaving him suddenly frozen. "Good," he said, his voice hoarse and failing terribly in the attempt to sound professional. The technique improved. I think we are ready for tomorrow." He turned to pick up his phone, unable to look at her. "I'll order a car to take you home. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Elena stood in the middle of the empty lobby, hugging her own arms as if she felt cold. The ring on her finger felt heavy. The dance had ended, but the music still echoed inside her, and his abrupt rejection hurt more than any criticism about her waltz steps. The night before the gala dinner should have been for rest, but the air in the penthouse office was thick, vibrating with silent tension. Elena had returned to retrieve the purse she had forgotten after dance rehearsal. The building was empty, a sleeping glass giant, except for a single light on in Julian's office. She hesitated in the hallway. The door was ajar. Through the crack, she saw Julian. He wasn't at the computer, nor analyzing blueprints. He was standing by the massive glass wall, his back to the door, looking at the city's reflection. But in his hand, he held something small. His shoulders, which he usually held with such rigid military precision, were slumped. The posture of the architect god had disappeared, there was just a lonely man. Elena knocked softly on the doorframe. "Julian?" He startled, turning quickly and placing the object on the desk with a dry thud. "Elena." His voice was rough. He cleared his throat, trying to recompose the mask of coldness. "I thought you had already gone home." "I forgot my keys," she lied softly, entering the room. She gestured to the desk. "I didn't mean to intrude." Julian followed her gaze to the object he had tried to hide. It was a silver picture frame, turned face down. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. On any other day, he would have ordered her to leave. But after the greenhouse, after the ring, after the dance, his defenses were in ruins. He let out a long, defeated sigh, and turned the frame over again. The photo, in black and white, showed a stern man in front of a building under construction, holding blueprints under his arm. He wasn't smiling. "My father," said Julian, his voice low. "Augustus Blackwood." Elena approached the desk, respecting his space, but offering her presence as support. "He looks intense." "He was a force of nature," said Julian, looking at the photo with a mixture of admiration and pain. "He built this company from nothing. He said architecture wasn't about comfort, it was about power. About leaving a mark that would last 1,000 years. Julian laughed, a bitter sound. "He died at his drafting table. Heart attack. I was 25. He finally looked up at Elena. The vulnerability in them was raw, disarming. "I live in constant fear of being a fraud, Elena. The Countess is right. My father had the vision, the cold genius. Me? I'm just the manager of his legacy. I write the checks and keep the lights on. I feel like I'm just occupying a giant's chair, waiting for someone to realize I'm too small for it." He had never told that to anyone. Not his therapists, not his partners. He was handing her the key to his greatest fear. Elena listened, and her heart ached for him. She didn't see the billionaire or the boss. She saw the boy who wanted to be a watchmaker, crushed by the weight of skyscrapers he never asked to build. She didn't offer clichés. She walked around the desk and stood beside him. "Your father built buildings, Julian," she said, her voice firm and clear in the silent room. "He built concrete monuments to himself. But you want to restore Villa d'Este not to prove power, but to save history." She pointed to his hands, the same hands that had fixed the pipes in her father's greenhouse. "You are not your father. And thank God for that. Your father would have never kneeled in the mud to help a florist save his orchids. Your father would have never seen value in a dried leaf or a forgotten garden." She looked deeply into his gray eyes. "You aren't living in his shadow, Julian. You are trying to bring light to places where he only saw stone. What you do, the way you care, that is much bigger than any building he ever raised." Her words weren't empty flattery. They were a profound validation of who he was, not what he owned. Julian's composure finally broke. He looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion he fought to contain. No one had ever separated the man from the myth. No one had ever said that being him was enough. A single tear escaped, tracing a quick path down his face before he wiped it with the back of his hand, turning his face away. But Elena had seen it. "Thank you, Elena," he whispered, his voice choked. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. She wasn't the project consultant anymore. She was his anchor. She was the only person in the world who seemed to understand the weight of the crown he wore. And for Julian, realizing he needed her, not for the contract, but for his own sanity, was the most terrifying moment of his life. The night of the gala ball arrived like a summer storm, electric and inevitable. Elena stood before the full-length mirror in her small studio, but barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The dress Julian had sent wasn't just a garment, it was a statement. It was a deep emerald green, made of velvet and silk, cascading over her body like running water. The neckline was discreet, but the back was bare, revealing soft skin. Around her neck, she wore an antique gold necklace, borrowed from the Blackwood family's personal collection, which matched perfectly with the engagement ring on her finger. When she descended to the lobby of her building, the doorman, Mr. Mendez, let his newspaper drop. Julian was waiting, leaning against the hood of the car. He wore a classic black tuxedo, cut with surgical precision, but he was restless, checking his wristwatch every 10 seconds. When he heard the sound of Elena's heels on the stone floor, he turned around. His social mask, that polite and distant smile he used for investors, evaporated instantly. His mouth parted slightly. His gray eyes scanned her from top to bottom, lingering on the curve of her neck, her waist accentuated by the dress, and returning to her eyes with a glint of stunned admiration. "Elena." His voice came out in a hoarse tone, almost unrecognizable. He took a step toward her, as if pulled by a magnet. "You are." He stopped, shaking his head, unable to find an architectural adjective that did her justice. "You are a masterpiece." Elena felt her face heat up. "It's the dress, Julian. It's incredible." "No," he said, taking her hand to help her into the car. His touch burned her skin. "The dress is just fabric. You are the one who gives it life." The ride to the event venue, the Museum of Natural History, rented exclusively for the occasion, was a cocoon of charged silence. Elena trembled slightly, the cold of the air conditioning mixed with pure nervousness. Julian noticed. Without saying a word, he extended his right hand and covered hers, which were clasped in her lap. His hand was warm, large, and protective. "Nervous?" he asked softly. "Only if you are," she replied, repeating the line they rehearsed, but feeling it for real. He squeezed her hand gently. "With you by my side? The foundation is firm. There is no chance of us falling." They found Countess Bianchi in the grand hall, under the immense skeleton of a dinosaur. She was a small but formidable woman, dressed in black, with pearls and a gaze that seemed like X-rays. The performance began. And it was flawless. They moved through the hall as a single entity. Julian introduced Elena not as a consultant, but as his partner. They shared knowing glances, laughed at inside jokes born in her parents' greenhouse, and his touch on her waist felt natural, possessive, and tender. At a certain point, during dinner, Countess Bianchi leaned forward, ignoring the plate of exquisite food. Her eyes, shrewd and tired, fixed on Elena. "My dear," said the Countess, with a heavy Italian accent. "I know Mr. Blackwood's reputation. They say he has ice in his veins and concrete in place of a heart. They say he sees the world only as profit per square meter." The table went silent. Julian stiffened beside Elena, preparing to defend his honor or change the subject. "I don't care about his portfolio," continued the Countess. "I want to know about the man. Tell me, Elena, why him? What did a woman with such lively eyes see in a man who designs cold glass towers?" The question was a trap. The script Julian prepared had answers about shared values and future vision. But Elena looked at Julian. She saw the tension in his jaw, the hidden fear in his gray eyes. She remembered him covered in grease in the greenhouse. She remembered him talking about watches. She remembered the lonely terror in the dark office. The script went into the trash. "Because he isn't made of glass, Countess," replied Elena, her voice soft but vibrating with honesty. She turned to the Countess, but kept her hand over Julian's. The world sees the architect who touches the sky. But I see the man who looks at the ground. I fell in love with him because he is the only person I know who would stop $1 million construction to save an ancient tree. Elena felt Julian's hand tremble under hers. She continued, the truth flowing from her like a river. He has the patience of a watchmaker. He cares for the details no one sees, the hidden gears, the foundations. In a world where everyone shouts to be noticed, Julian listens to what isn't said. He doesn't have ice in his veins, Countess. He has a deep stillness. And it is in that stillness that I found my home. The silence at the table was absolute. The answer wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, beautiful, and devastating. Julian looked at Elena, shocked. His mask fell completely. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and an overwhelming emotion he couldn't name, but which made his chest ache. Countess Bianchi observed the two. She looked at the tear shining, unshed, in Elena's eyes. Then, she looked at Julian's disarmed expression. A slow, satisfied smile appeared on the old lady's face. Bene, she whispered. Finally. I see the rumors were wrong. There is life in Villa Blackwood, after all. The dinner ended, but the night still demanded one last act. While the waiters collected the crystal glasses, Julian gently touched Elena's elbow. The Countess went to get fresh air on the garden terrace, he whispered, his warm breath against her ear. It's our chance to seal the deal. Let's go. He guided her through the French glass doors to the museum terrace. The night air was fresh, heavy with the scent of night jasmine. The view of the city was spectacular, but Julian didn't look at the lights. He led Elena to a more secluded corner, under the shadow of a wisteria-covered pergola, where they knew they could be seen from afar, but not heard. Julian leaned against the stone balustrade and pulled Elena to stand between his legs, facing him. The intimacy of the pose made Elena's heart race against her ribs. She is watching us from the door, murmured Julian, without taking his eyes off Elena's lips. His hands moved up from her waist to hold her face, his thumbs tracing her jawline with a reverence that seemed anything but staged. We need to make this look real, Elena. Elena looked at him, into the gray eyes that looked like a storm about to break. Julian. For the project, he said, as if trying to convince himself. For the villa. He lowered his head and kissed her. It started as a technical performance, a calculated pressure of lips to create a romantic silhouette in the moonlight. But the second their mouths touched, logic crumbled. The wall Julian had spent his entire life building around himself exploded. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent, hungry, desperate. His hands plunged into her hair, undoing the elegant hairstyle, pulling her closer, as if he wanted to merge her into his own body. Elena responded with the same intensity. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her body molding to his. It wasn't a kiss for the Countess. It wasn't a kiss to save the flower shop. It was the kiss of two lonely souls who had finally found each other in the dark. It was the answer to the dance in the atrium, to the conversation in the car, to the silence in the greenhouse. They kissed until the air ran out, until the world spun and ceased to exist. When they finally separated, their foreheads rested against each other, their breathing mixed and irregular. His scent, sandalwood, rain, and desire, was impregnated in her skin. Elena. His voice was a broken whisper, full of a terrifying truth. For a moment, there in the dark, the line between the lie and reality wasn't just blurred, it was erased. But then, the distant sound of applause or laughter coming from the hall broke the spell. Julian stiffened. He blinked, and the fog of passion dissipated, replaced by the cold panic of reality. What had he just done? He had lost control. He, the man of precision, had let himself be carried away by chaos. He released her and took a step back, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. His face closed instantly, the CEO mask falling back into place like a vault door slamming shut. The drive back to Elena's apartment was a tomb. The silence in the car wasn't the comfortable silence of the trip there, it was heavy, suffocating, full of unspoken words screaming in the air conditioning. Elena looked out the window, seeing the reflection of her own pale and confused face. She still felt his taste on her lips. When Julian stopped the car in front of her building, he didn't turn off the engine. He kept his hands gripped on the steering wheel, knuckles white, staring straight ahead. "Thank you, Elena," he said. His voice was cold, distant, professional. It was the voice he used to fire incompetent contractors. He was rebuilding the fortress, brick by painful brick, to protect himself from what he felt. "You were perfect tonight," he continued, without looking at her. The Countess was convinced. "The villa contract will be signed tomorrow. The payment for your parents' debt will be processed first thing in the morning." Elena felt as if she had been slapped. "The payment?" she repeated, her voice weak. "Yes. Our deal." He finally turned his head to her. His gray eyes were empty, dead. "You fulfilled your part of the contract. It was a flawless performance. That kiss on the terrace was the perfect final touch. Very convincing." The word convincing cut Elena like glass. He was reducing the most real moment of her life to a negotiation tactic. He was saying it meant nothing. The pain in her chest was sharp, bitter. But Elena Rossi had the pride of someone who survives harsh winters. She swallowed the tears threatening to rise. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. If he wanted to play the game of cold professionalism, she would play too. "Of course," she said, her voice cutting in cold, a mirror of his. She opened the car door. "It was my job, Mr. Blackwood. I am very good at what I do." She got out of the car and slammed the door. The sound was definitive. "The ring," she said, leaning into the open window, starting to pull it off her finger. "Keep it," said Julian quickly, almost in panic, his voice failing for a second. "As a bonus. For the success of the project." "No," she said. "I don't want bonuses that come loaded with lies." She took the ring off forcefully and dropped it on the passenger seat. The emerald shone one last time under the street light before sitting motionless on the dark leather. "Good night, Julian. I hope the villa and your legacy keep you warm at night. Because concrete is very cold when you are alone." She turned her back and entered the building without looking back. Julian stayed in the car, watching the lobby light turn on and off. He looked at the ring on the empty seat beside him. The inscription foundation was hidden on the inside, but he knew it was there. And he knew, with devastating certainty, that he had just demolished the only real thing he had ever built, leaving only ruins behind. Monday dawned gray, a perfect mirror of Elena's state of mind. She didn't cry over the weekend. The tears had dried up by Friday night, replaced by a painful, cold clarity. She spent the 2 days in the studio, packing her sketches, gathering her plants. She couldn't continue at Blackwood Designs. She couldn't sit at that desk in the corner and look at the private elevator, knowing the man upstairs had held her heart in his hands and treated it like an inventory item. She entered the glass building at 9 o'clock sharp. She didn't go to her desk. She went straight to the elevator that led to the penthouse. Julian's executive secretary tried to bar her. "Mr. Blackwood is on an international conference call, Elena. You can't." Elena walked past her without slowing down. "It will be quick." She opened the office door. Julian was standing, his back to the entrance, speaking on the phone in fluent Italian. He looked imposing, in control, master of his universe. But when he heard the door open and turned, seeing the expression on Elena's face, he stopped mid-sentence. "Scusa, un momento," he said, muting the phone and lowering the device. "Elena? What are you doing?" "I'm finalizing the banking details for the villa." Elena walked to the glass desk. She wasn't trembling. She placed a white envelope on the polished surface. The contrast of the cheap paper against the expensive glass was stark. "My resignation letter," she said. Her voice held no anger, it had the final tone of a closing door. Julian looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb. "Resignation?" He laughed, a nervous, incredulous sound. "Why?" "The villa project was a success. The payment for your parents has already been made. You will receive a substantial bonus." "We won, Elena." "You won, Julian," she corrected softly. "You got your building. You saved your legacy." She took a deep breath, fighting to maintain composure as the image of the kiss on the terrace invaded her mind. "But I can't do this. I can't come here every day and pretend that kiss was just a contract clause. I can't work for a man who prefers to build walls where windows should be." Julian dropped the phone on the desk. The click sounded loud in the silence. "Elena, be reasonable. It was one night. It was a necessary performance. Don't throw your career away because of misplaced feelings." "Misplaced feelings?" She smiled sadly. "It was the only real thing at that dinner. And the fact that you are so terrified that you call it work tells me everything I need to know. Keep your tower, Julian. It's beautiful. But it's very lonely up here." She turned her back and left. Julian took a step to follow her, his hand outstretched, his mouth open to say, "What? Stay?" "I lied." But pride, that old faithful bodyguard, locked his throat. The door closed. The silence returned. He was alone. The following week dragged on like a year. The office functioned. Deadlines were met. But for Julian, it was like living in a silent black and white movie. He hired a new senior landscape architect, a woman with 3 master's degrees and relentless efficiency. She never corrected him. Never left dried leaves in his car. Never challenged him to step out of his comfort zone. Julian was a functional mess. He signed documents without reading them. He yelled at an intern because the coffee was too cold. He spent hours looking at the empty desk in the corner of the landscaping department downstairs, through the security cameras, feeling a phantom pain, as if a vital part of his body had been amputated. He told himself it was just post-project stress. That it would pass. On Friday afternoon, the email arrived. The subject shown on the computer screen, confirmation, Villa d'Este property transferred. It should have been the moment of glory. The culmination of years of work. The definitive victory over his father's shadow. He had mentally popped the champagne so many times for this moment. Julian read the words. The deal is closed. He felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, no triumph. Just a hollow echo in his chest. He looked at the villa model on the side table. Suddenly, it didn't look like a historic legacy. It looked like just an old dollhouse made of plaster and wood. An empty structure. He stood up and walked to the window. The sky outside was black, a violent summer storm crashing down on the city, washing the glass with torrents of water. The truth hit him with the force of lightning. He had the villa. He had the prestige. He had proved the Countess wrong, or had he? A man without a heart, she had said. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He had sacrificed the only person who saw the watchmaker inside him for a building. He had traded the warmth of the greenhouse for the coldness of marble. "You idiot," he whispered to his reflection. "You complete idiot." Panic set in. Not the panic of missing a deadline, but the visceral panic of someone realizing they let the most precious thing in the world slip through their fingers. He didn't think. Architectural logic was thrown out the window. Julian grabbed his car keys. He didn't take his jacket. He didn't turn off the computer. He ran out of the office, ignoring the secretary shouting something about a budget meeting. He got into the elevator and pressed the ground floor button repeatedly, as if he could make time go faster. When the doors opened, he ran to the parking lot, got into the black car, and screeched his tires on the way out. The rain was torrential, turning streets into rivers, but Julian didn't take his foot off the gas. He wasn't driving to her apartment. He knew, instinctively, where she would be in a storm like that. The place where she felt safe. The place where her roots were. He drove toward the outskirts, toward the blinking neon sign and the peeling walls of Flora Rossi. He had an empire to manage, but in that moment, the only thing that mattered in the world was getting to the plant girl before it was too late to tell the truth. Julian's car skidded into the dirt entrance of Flora Rossi, tires flinging mud everywhere. The rain fell in thick sheets, turning the world into a gray and noisy blur. Julian got out of the car. He didn't bother closing the door. He didn't worry about his $1,000 leather shoes sinking into the mud. He ran toward the faint light emanating from the main greenhouse, the rain soaking his white shirt in seconds, plastering the fabric to his skin and turning his perfectly combed hair into a dark mess. He pushed open the glass door of the greenhouse. The sound of the storm outside was muffled, replaced by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the glass roof and the warm, humid smell of soil and flowers. Elena was there, standing on a stool, trying to secure a tarp under a leak in the old roof. When she heard the door open violently, she turned, startled, almost losing her balance. Upon seeing the soaked and panting figure standing in the entrance, she climbed down from the stool slowly, eyes wide. "Julian?" Her voice was a whisper of disbelief. "What? What are you doing here? You're soaked." Julian didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her. She was wearing dirty denim overalls and an old t-shirt, her hair in a messy bun. And to him, she looked more real and more important than any architectural blueprint he had ever drawn. He took a stumbling step forward, looking like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. "I was a fool," he said. His voice was broken, hoarse, competing with the noise of the rain on the glass. A complete, arrogant fool. He walked toward her, ignoring the water dripping from his clothes onto the packed dirt floor. "I received the email," he continued, words coming out fast, desperate. "The villa is mine. The contract is signed. I won." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And I stood there, at the top of my glass tower, looking at that paper, and I felt like the poorest person in the world." Elena hugged her own body, protecting herself not from the cold, but from his intensity. "Julian, please, don't do this." "I have to do this," he shouted, the mask of control totally shattered. "I spent my life building walls so no one would see that I am not my father. So no one would see that I am just a man who likes watches and is afraid of heights. But you saw, Elena." He stopped inches from her. His gray eyes, usually so cold, were burning. "You saw the gears. You saw the foundation. And I treated you as if you were disposable. As if you were brick and mortar." He brought his hands to his face, wiping away the rain and mixed tears. "The villa is worth nothing if I don't have someone to share the view with. My legacy is just dust if you aren't part of it." Elena looked at him, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the regret in every line of his body. "You're saying this because of the adrenaline, Julian. the rain. Tomorrow you'll wake up and be Mr. Blackwood again. No, he said firmly. He took her hands. His hands were freezing, hers were warm. Mr. Blackwood stayed in that office. Who is here is Julian. The man who fell in love with you. The confession hung in the humid air of the greenhouse. I don't know when it happened, he whispered, squeezing her hands. Maybe when you challenged me in the meeting. Maybe when we ate cheap sandwiches. Or when we danced in the atrium. But it happened. And it is the most solid structure I have ever felt in my life. He looked deep into her eyes, pleading. I don't need a fake fiancé to impress a countess, Elena. I need you. As my partner. As my critic. As my love. For all nights, not just one. Elena stood motionless, processing the storm before her. The man who controlled the city skyline was there, in the mud, destroyed and rebuilt by the truth. She let out a trembling sigh and, with her free hand, touched his wet face. You're going to catch pneumonia, she said, her voice choked, but with a small, trembling smile appearing on her lips. I don't care, he replied, leaning his face into her palm. I care, she whispered. Elena pulled him by the hand, not outside, but to the back of the greenhouse, where there was a small gas heater and an electric kettle on a workbench. The rain continued to roar outside, but in there, the world reduced to the two of them. She took an old towel her father used to wipe his hands and began to dry his hair. Julian closed his eyes, letting himself be cared for, surrendering completely. When she finished, she stood in front of him. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. Julian, she said softly. My world is dirty with soil. It's uncertain. Plants die, the weather changes. There are no guarantees, no reinforced concrete. Can you handle that? Julian opened his eyes and held her face with both hands. My world was gray and static before you. I don't want guarantees, Elena. I want life. I want you. Tears began to run down Elena's face, warm and liberating. I fell in love with you too, you stubborn architect, she confessed. The relief on Julian's face was like the sunrise. He didn't wait anymore. He leaned in and kissed her. This time, there was no countess watching. No fancy terrace, no tuxedo, no strategy. There was just the rain beating on the glass, the smell of orchids, and two people who, amidst the chaos, had finally found the place where they belonged. It was a slow, deep kiss, tasting of promise and rain. And there, between bags of fertilizer and rare flowers, the true foundation was finally healed. 1 year later, the Tuscan sun bathed the stone terraces of Villa d'Este with a golden, lazy light. The place was unrecognizable. What were once ruins covered in wild ivy were now meticulously restored gardens, where architectural precision met nature's exuberance. And in the center of the scene, under an arch of newly planted white roses, Julian Blackwood waited. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't analyzing the symmetry of the altar. He was simply standing, hands in pockets and an easy, relaxed smile on his face, watching a bee land on a nearby lavender. The Iceman had melted completely. In the front row, Countess Bianchi wiped a discreet tear with a lace handkerchief. Beside her, Marco and Sophia Rossi looked like kings in their pride, Marco wearing a suit Julian had insisted on having custom-made for him. The music began. Not a traditional wedding march, but the same waltz they played that night in the empty office atrium. Elena appeared at the top of the stone staircase. Her dress wasn't a rigid haute couture piece. It was fluid, with embroidery of wildflowers at the hem, and in her hair, instead of a diamond tiara, she wore a simple crown of olive leaves and small white flowers. When Julian saw her, his breath hitched, exactly like on the night of the ball. But this time, there was no fear. There was only gratitude. She walked to him, and when their hands met, it was as if two roots finally intertwined underground. I had a speech prepared, Julian began, when it was time for the vows. He took a paper from his pocket, looked at it, smiled, and put it back. But Elena taught me that the best plans are the ones we allow to change. He looked into her eyes, and his voice, clear and strong, echoed through the garden. I spent my life believing that safety came from concrete and steel. That if I built walls high enough, nothing would reach me. But you showed me that true strength isn't in resisting the wind, but in dancing with it. You planted life in my desert, Elena. You are my north, my shelter, and above all, my foundation. Elena smiled, eyes full of tears of joy. She took his hand and held up the antique emerald ring, the same ring she had left on the car seat that rainy night, and which Julian had kept like a treasure until they could be there. This ring started as a lie, she said, her voice choked. A theater prop engraved with a word that seemed too heavy, foundation. But you proved to be worthy of that word. You showed me that love isn't just a wild feeling, it's a daily construction. It's choosing to stay, brick by brick, day after day. She slid the ring onto his finger, a new band that matched hers. So, yes, Julian Blackwood. Yes to your architecture, yes to your gears, and yes to us. Always. The kiss that sealed the union wasn't technical, nor desperate. It was joyful. It was the kiss of someone who knows they have come home. 6 months later, back in the city, a glass structure shone on a once-abandoned corner of the urban center. The discreet sign at the entrance read, "The Sanctuary." It wasn't just a flower shop, nor just an architectural firm. It was a magical hybrid. The ground floor was a lush urban greenhouse, dedicated to rare and forgotten plants, Elena's dream realized. The mezzanine was an open design studio, where Julian and his team worked surrounded by greenery, designing buildings that breathed. Elena was at the counter, teaching a client how to care for a delicate fern, when the door opened. A young couple of students entered, looking around with admiration at how the steel beams seemed to grow like tree trunks. Julian came down the spiral stairs, shirt sleeves rolled up and a pencil behind his ear. He went to Elena, wrapped his arm around her waist, and kissed her temple, a gesture of automatic and quiet intimacy. The young student approached, shyly. "Mr. Blackwood? I'm a big fan of your work. The way this place mixes structure with life is genius. What is the secret? How do you balance the weight of the roof with the fragility of the plants?" Julian looked at the glass roof he had designed, and then looked at Elena, who was smiling at him with that sparkle in her brown eyes that still made his heart race. "It's not about balance, son," replied Julian, gently squeezing his wife's waist. "It's about knowing what supports what. The glass protects the flower, but it is the flower that gives the glass a reason to exist." He turned fully to Elena, ignoring the world outside for a second. "Find someone who gives you a reason to build," advised Julian. "And the rest of the project designs itself." Elena laughed and offered him a coffee, and as they stood there, surrounded by the green she cultivated and the walls he had raised, it was clear to anyone watching, that was the most successful project of their lives. It wasn't made of stone, nor of flowers. It was made of truth. And it was built to last forever. The end.